It was the kind of confession that doesn't just ripple through Hollywood, it detonates. At 77, legendary actor and comedian Billy Crystal sat down for what was supposed to be a light-hearted retrospective on his decades-long career. But what he said instead turned the interview into a bombshell. For words, softly spoken, trembling on the edge of a lifetime of silence. We got intimate. He wasn't talking about a secret affair with a long-forgotten co-star. He wasn't talking about a fleeting romance during a film shoot. No, he was talking about Rob Reiner. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Yes, that Rob Reiner. The comedic genius behind this is Spinal Tap, the directorial force behind When Harry Met Sally. The man who, for 5 decades, stood beside Billy Crystal not just as a friend, but as something more, something no one dared put a label on, until now. But before the world could even catch its breath from Billy's emotional revelation, something far darker came crashing into the public consciousness. A murder. 2 victims. 1 suspect. Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle, were found stabbed to death in their $13.5 million Brentwood estate. The suspect? Their own son, Nick, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. And if that weren't horrifying enough, it was their daughter, Romy, just 27 years old, who found the bodies. And what she told the police during her frantic 911 call, it wasn't just a plea for help. It was a warning. There's someone dangerous in the family, she reportedly said. Start with the basement. You should be a suspect. What was she talking about? Who was she pointing to? And why the basement? And now, as the LAPD scrambles to piece together a case that reads like a Hollywood screenplay, complete with jealousy, betrayal, and unspoken truths, one name keeps resurfacing: Billy Crystal. His voice, his journal, his memories. Because it wasn't just a friendship. Not anymore. Not since that night in 1993. Not since the moment their laughter gave way to tears, and their bond crossed a line even they never dared define. So what happened? What happened between Billy and Rob? What happened inside the Reiner home on the night of the murders? And how does a decades-long friendship, one filled with love, secrets, and emotional intimacy, tie into one of the most shocking double homicides Hollywood has ever seen? Let's start from the beginning. But be warned, this isn't just a story about murder. It's a story about what happens when silence festers, when secrets rot, when the people we think we know best turn out to be strangers. And in the end, it's a story about love. A kind of love that never made it into the scripts. A kind of love that no one wanted to talk about. Until now. To understand what made Billy's confession so explosive, we need to rewind. Not just to the night of the murder. Not just to the 90s. But to the 70s. The golden age of comedy. The smoky backstage of New York City's comedy clubs. The era of bell-bottoms, sitcoms, and scotch-soaked rehearsals. That's where it started. Billy and Rob met while working on All in the Family, where Rob had already begun carving his name into Hollywood's Mount Rushmore. Billy was still rising, still figuring out who he was, not just as a performer, but as a man. From the start, their chemistry was electric. Not romantic. Not yet. Just undeniable. Like 2 sides of the same coin. Billy brought the improvisational madness. Rob brought the structure, the vision. Together, they were a storm of creativity. They bonded over everything. Bad jokes, worse auditions, late-night diners, failed relationships. They stayed up talking about everything and nothing. Rob confided in Billy when his marriage hit rocky waters. Billy opened up about feeling like an outsider in the industry. They became each other's anchors in a world built on ego and illusion. And over time, something changed. Their weekends stretched into retreats. Their conversations turned vulnerable. Their laughter turned tender. There's a photo, rarely seen, buried deep in an old archive from 1982. It's not scandalous. Just the 2 of them sitting on a dock at Lake Arrowhead, beers in hand, legs dangling over the water. Rob's head rests against Billy's shoulder. Billy's hand rests lightly on Rob's knee. It's not romantic, but it's intimate, deeply intimate. People whispered. Friends speculated. But no one said a word. Because in that era, in that industry, in that world, there were some things you didn't talk about. Especially not if you were 2 straight-passing Jewish comedians at the height of your careers. And so they didn't talk about it. Not to the press. Not to their families. Maybe not even to themselves. But now, decades later, Billy's confession has cracked that silence wide open. And the timing? That's where things get eerie. Billy's full revelation didn't come out in a glossy magazine spread or a book tour Q&A. It came in a recorded deposition. Yes, you heard that right. A deposition. Because Billy Crystal, as it turns out, had been quietly cooperating with investigators in the Reiner double homicide case. Not as a suspect, but as a witness. Why? Because Rob had confided in him. About Nick. About his fears. About his guilt. And maybe, just maybe, about something else too. Something that Billy wrote down in his private journal. The one that was subpoenaed by LAPD 2 weeks after the murders. The journal that reportedly contains the phrase. He told me he couldn't live with the lie anymore. What lie? Was Rob finally ready to come out? Was he planning to tell Michelle? Romy? The world? Or was that lie about something else entirely? A cover-up? A threat? A secret deeper and darker than any romantic entanglement? All we know is this: something snapped inside that house. The official autopsy report lists multiple sharp force injuries as the cause of death. The coroner stated that Michelle had defensive wounds. Rob did not. That's not just chilling. That's telling. She fought. He didn't. Was he asleep? Was he drugged? Or did he know the killer? And then there's Romy. Sweet, soft-spoken Romy. The daughter who found her parents' bodies. The daughter who, according to reports, told police, "I know who did this, but I'm afraid to say it out loud." Afraid of what? Afraid of who? And then there's the final, most chilling twist. When LAPD searched the Brentwood Estates guest house, where Nick Reiner was living, they found a knife, bloodied, hidden beneath floorboards. They also found a laptop. On that laptop were dozens of unsent emails, drafts, screeds, screams in digital form. And one draft had a subject line that stopped everyone cold. He chose Billy over me. That's not just a confession. That's a motive. So now the world waits. For the trial. For the truth. For the fallout. But the story doesn't begin in that courtroom. It begins with a love that never had a name. A friendship that defied labels. And a moment in time when two men crossed a line and spent the rest of their lives pretending they hadn't. Until now. Because now, the silence has shattered. And what comes next? No one saw it coming. What happens when a laugh turns into a glance? When a glance lingers too long? And the silence between two friends says more than 1,000 jokes ever could. This wasn't a story about scandal. It was a story about the slow burn of something deeper than friendship. And maybe, just maybe, too fragile to survive in the spotlight. It started, oddly enough, with laughter. Billy and Rob were comedy's golden boys, each in their own lane, but often crossing paths. Television brought them together, but what kept them bound wasn't the cameras, it was the in-between moments. The long drives between gigs, the shared hotel rooms when budgets were tight, the dinners after rap when neither wanted to go home. To the world, they were just close, just creative partners, best pals. But privately, things were blurry. They always had been. You ever had someone in your life who knows your punchline before you do? That was Rob to Billy. That was Billy to Rob. But as the years went on, their closeness became harder to explain. Billy once told a friend, quietly, late at night, after one too many drinks, that being around Rob felt like coming home after a long day. Like slipping off a mask he didn't know he was wearing. No expectations. No judgments. Just peace. Rob, for his part, was less poetic. But he showed it. The hand on the shoulder that lingered. The inside jokes no one else understood. The occasional heated argument that burned too hot for just friends. It wasn't romantic, not in the traditional sense. But it wasn't platonic, either. It was something else. Something complicated. Something unnamed. And maybe that was the problem. Because when you don't name something, you can't protect it. Let's go back to 1991. Billy had just wrapped filming City Slickers. Rob had just finished directing Misery, his first true dramatic success. They were both riding high, both exhausted, both, according to sources, utterly lost in their personal lives. Billy's marriage was in a slump. Rob's was full of unspoken tensions. They met up in Lake Tahoe for a short getaway. No press, no wives. Just the two of them. According to a journal entry later leaked from Billy's private collection, it was that weekend when something shifted. He writes, "We stayed up late, drank whiskey, talked about fathers, about failing as husbands, About the pressure. At some point, he sat across from me, eyes watery, and said, "Sometimes I think you're the only person who really sees me." I laughed. Then I stopped, because I realized I'd never felt more seen either. And for a moment, the space between us disappeared. There's no mention of anything physical. No kiss. No embrace. But the emotion? It bleeds through the ink. It wasn't a fling. It wasn't a secret affair. It was emotional entanglement. The kind that makes everything after feel different. And when they returned to LA, something had changed. Billy canceled 2 appearances. Rob pulled out of a press junket. There were rumors of a falling out. But by the next month, they were spotted again, laughing, arm in arm, at a Hollywood fundraiser. Business as usual. Or so it seemed. Behind the scenes, however, their dynamic had shifted. They grew closer and more protective. Phone calls late into the night. Notes passed on set. Shared vacations, sometimes with their spouses, sometimes not. Insiders began to whisper. One crew member from The Princess Bride said, "They acted like a married couple, always finishing each other's sentences, arguing over stupid stuff." But the weird part? Neither seemed to care what people thought. But of course, they did care. How could they not? This was the early 90s. The entertainment world wasn't kind to ambiguity, especially not the kind that threatened to unravel a pair of beloved, family-friendly icons. So they buried it. Billy threw himself into work, Mr. Saturday Night, then Forget Paris. Rob doubled down on directing. They didn't drift apart, exactly, but they compartmentalized. They had to. Their families demanded it. Their careers demanded it. Their reputations demanded it. But even under all that pressure, they kept finding their way back to each other. And then came the big one. When Harry Met Sally. It wasn't just a hit. It was the hit. The chemistry between Meg Ryan and Billy Crystal? Legendary. But behind the camera, the real spark was the creative dance between Billy and Rob. They obsessed over every line, every pause, every breath. They fought. They laughed. They wept. One production assistant reportedly saw them, alone on set, sitting silently on a bench between takes. Just sitting. No words. Just presence. She said, "It felt sacred. Like I was interrupting something bigger than I could understand." And maybe she was. Because that movie, that sweet, romantic, iconic movie, wasn't just about Harry and Sally. It was, in many ways, about Rob and Billy. About 2 people who didn't know how to define what they had. Who tried to stay friends when the feelings demanded more. Who feared losing everything if they admitted the truth. Sound familiar? And yet, life moved on. They married. They raised kids. They grew older. The world saw 2 best friends aging gracefully in the Hollywood spotlight. But the truth? They never stopped orbiting each other. Even when years passed between projects. Even when their families drifted. There was always a phone call. A handwritten card. A surprise visit. And every time they were in a room together, the air shifted. People felt it. Some said nothing. Some joked. A few, according to one anonymous source, envied it. Because that kind of connection, it's rare. And that's what makes what happened next so hard to stomach. Because if you believe Billy's journal, Rob was finally ready to say it. To name what they had. To tell his wife. To tell his children. Maybe even to tell the world. And then he was murdered. Stabbed in his own home. By his son. And that journal entry, the one that reads, "He told me he couldn't live with the lie anymore," now sits at the center of a murder investigation. It's no longer just a confession. It's evidence. And what comes next? No one saw it coming. Blood doesn't lie. And when it's splattered across marble floors, soaked into $1,000 rugs, and trailing down the hallway of a multi-million-dollar estate, it screams louder than any confession ever could. Brentwood. One of the quietest, wealthiest neighborhoods in Los Angeles. A place where the gates are high, the lawns are manicured, and scandal is meant to stay behind closed doors. But not that night. Not when emergency dispatchers received a frantic call from a young woman sobbing, barely able to speak. It was Romy Reiner, daughter of Rob and Michelle, and her words were not what anyone expected. "They're dead," she cried. "My parents, they're covered in blood." And then she said it, not with panic, not with confusion, but with certainty. "There's someone dangerous in the family. Start with the basement. He should be a suspect." It was as if she'd been waiting for this moment. As if some part of her had seen it coming. Let's rewind. It was a quiet Sunday evening. The Reiners had just returned from a charity event in Beverly Hills. A typical Hollywood affair: paparazzi flashes, champagne toasts, and forced smiles. Rob had reportedly looked tired, Michelle stiff. Friends described them as tense but composed. The couple left early. No one thought much of it. By 9:12 p.m., according to security footage, their Range Rover pulled into the driveway of their $13.5 million Brentwood estate. By 11:03 p.m., both of them were dead. The timeline is narrow, but what happened within it was unspeakable. Their home security system had been disabled. Not from outside, from within. Investigators found no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no tampered locks. But they did find something strange: a small stack of old photographs, torn, burnt around the edges, scattered across the kitchen table. In one of them, Rob stood next to Billy Crystal, smiling, arms linked, heads pressed together. The photo had been ripped in half. Billy's half was missing. When Romy arrived the next morning, something didn't feel right. She'd been texting her mom all night. No replies. She called, straight to voicemail. It wasn't like them. So she used her spare key and entered the house just before 10 a.m. What she saw would change everything. Her mother was lying at the base of the stairs, face down, motionless. Blood pooled beneath her hands, which were curled as if she'd tried to crawl. Her father was slumped over the living room couch, a white throw blanket stained red beneath his head. He'd been stabbed multiple times, but there were no signs of struggle. And that detail, that's what disturbed police the most. Because Michelle had fought. Her hands were bruised, scratches on her forearms, wounds on her back that suggested she tried to escape. But Rob was still, peaceful, as if he never saw it coming. Or maybe he didn't fight back. Maybe he knew who it was. Maybe he let it happen. Within hours, the property was swarming with detectives, forensic teams, and media helicopters. The Reiner residence became a crime scene. Brentwood became a headline. But in the guest house, tucked behind the main estate, authorities found someone else. Nick Reiner, their son, disheveled, shirtless, eyes wide, rambling. He wasn't trying to flee. He wasn't hiding. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, rocking slightly, holding a small framed photo of himself as a child, standing between his parents. The glass was shattered. Blood smeared across his fingers. When officers asked him what happened, he whispered one line: "They chose Billy." That's when they arrested him. Nick Reiner had a troubled history. It wasn't a secret. Rehab stints, public breakdowns, a strained relationship with his father that had been quietly managed behind Hollywood's PR machine for years. But murder? No one saw that coming. And yet, the evidence was damning. In the kitchen sink, a butcher knife. Bloody, washed but not well. Forensics later confirmed it matched the wounds on both victims. In Nick's bedroom, his laptop, open, on screen. A half-written email addressed to no one. A draft, never sent. He lied to her for years. Lied to me. Lied to the world. And for what? For Billy F********** ing Crystal? That line shook everyone. Was this about jealousy? A personal vendetta? Or was it something more complex? And then came the second discovery. Behind a bookshelf in the guest house, LAPD found a journal. Nick's handwriting. Dozens of pages. Some entries were incoherent rants. Paranoid delusions about being followed, watched, manipulated. Others, cold, calculated, obsessed. In one entry, dated just 2 days before the murders. I heard them again, whispering. In the study, Mom asking questions, Dad dodging them. She knows. She finally knows. He said Billy's name. He said he had to tell her. If he does, everything falls apart. And I'm the collateral damage. That wasn't just rage. That was motive. But what truly shook investigators, and later, the public, was the note found beneath Rob Reiner's body. It wasn't a suicide note. It wasn't even signed. It was scribbled hastily, torn from a yellow legal pad, half legible. But the last line? It read, "Forgive me, Billy. I should have told her sooner." What did that mean? Was Rob preparing to come clean? Was he finally going to tell Michelle about his emotional intimacy with Billy Crystal? Was he going to tell his kids? Or was it something darker? Did he know his son had been watching, listening, waiting? And if so, because sometimes it's not the weapon that kills, it's the secret. And in this case, that secret was decades in the making. But what was hidden in that basement, beneath the stairs, behind the false wall? That's what truly terrified investigators. Because it wasn't just about Nick. It wasn't just about Rob and Billy. It was something no one expected. And what came next would shake the case to its core. What if the person you trust least shares your DNA? What if the threat doesn't come from outside your home, but from within your bloodline? In the weeks following the murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner, the LAPD wasn't just investigating a crime. They were unraveling a psyche, a fractured mind that had been quietly crumbling for years. And at the center of it was Nick Reiner. To the public, Nick was a Hollywood prince, the troubled son of an entertainment titan. He'd struggled, sure, but who hadn't? Addiction, depression, anger issues, arrest for possession, a stint in rehab before he was old enough to vote. But wasn't that just another chapter in the well-worn playbook of celebrity offspring? That's what they thought, until they opened his notebooks. The basement, it was always off limits. According to Romy, even as kids, they were told not to go down there when Nick was working. But what was he working on? Detectives found the door locked from the inside. They pried it open. What they uncovered felt less like a workspace and more like a shrine, or a war room. The walls were covered in clippings, articles, photographs, handwritten notes connected with red string. Not of celebrities, not of conspiracies, of his own family. Michelle's smiling headshot taped next to a photo of her frowning. The words "two faces" written in Sharpie. A torn-out magazine photo of Rob and Billy Crystal laughing together on a red carpet. Surrounded by handwritten arrows and the word "liars" repeated over and over again. One photo of Billy circled, scribbled with a single word, replacement. But that wasn't the worst of it. On the far wall, duct taped to a sheet of cardboard, was a hand-drawn flowchart. At the top, betrayal. Beneath it, a sequence. Rob Billy's secret. Michelle finds out. Romy sides with him. Nick equals out. One detective described it as paranoid, obsessive. Like he'd written his own mythology where he was always the victim. But was it all delusion? Or did it contain twisted shards of truth? Here's what the investigation uncovered. Nick had become increasingly unhinged in the months leading up to the murders. He'd stopped attending therapy, stopped taking prescribed medication, isolated himself. He'd been sending strange messages to friends, rambling about inheritance betrayal and family lies. One chilling voice memo, sent 2 weeks before the murders, captures him muttering, "They smile in public, but behind closed doors they lie. They cheat. They erase you. He never loved Mom. He never loved me. Only loved him." It was never clear who him was. Until now. Psychiatrists called in to evaluate Nick after his arrest described symptoms consistent with schizoaffective disorder, paranoia, hallucinations, disorganized thinking. But mental illness alone doesn't explain what came next. In one session, Nick reportedly told the court-appointed psychiatrist, "My dad told me once that Billy was the one who got away. What was I supposed to do with that? You're a kid, and your dad confesses he wished someone else was his partner." The doctor paused him, asked if he was speaking metaphorically. Nick just smiled, then said, "Wouldn't you want revenge?" But let's rewind even further. To the origin. Nick never had a typical childhood. He was born into privilege, yes. But also pressure. Pressure to be funny, smart, brilliant, to live up to a legacy built by a man beloved by millions. But Rob, according to insiders, was distant, distracted, engulfed in work. It was Michelle who raised the kids day to day, who protected them, who endured Nick's early outbursts. School reports described Nick as bright, volatile, prone to disruptive episodes. He was suspended twice before age 12, expelled once by 15, and the one constant through it all, his obsession with his father's attention, which, according to friends, he rarely got. Rob would be in the editing room, on set, at premieres, said one former family friend. Nick was always chasing his approval. And when Billy was around, forget it. Rob's attention was 100% elsewhere. Billy Crystal, for all his charm and warmth, became a symbol in Nick's mind. Not just of affection stolen, but of identity erased. Billy was smart, witty, beloved by Rob's fans. Even Romy adored him, once calling Billy Uncle Hart. But to Nick, he was the intruder, the imposter, the one who occupied the emotional real estate Nick believed was his. Over time, Billy became more than a man. He became a threat. And when Rob, perhaps recklessly, shared past regrets with Nick. It lit a fire he couldn't control. There's speculation that during one of their rare one-on-one dinners, Rob hinted at his emotional bond with Billy, possibly even his romantic confusion. Did he tell Nick the full truth? Or did Nick twist it into something darker? We may never know. What we do know is this. Nick began writing in his basement. Dozens of journals, scripts, poems, rants, and one short play titled The Replacement, a one-act tragedy. The plot. A son confronts his father about his long-hidden affair with the son's mentor. The ending? The son kills both. Now, the prosecution says this play was a premeditation. The defense calls it fiction. A therapeutic exercise from a mentally ill young man. But here's the contradiction. How does someone so broken plan something so precise? Because make no mistake, the murders weren't random. The autopsy revealed Michelle died first. She was stabbed in the back, likely caught off guard. Rob died minutes later. Clean, quick, clinical. And the security system? Disabled manually. By someone who knew the code. Someone who lived there. One final, gut-wrenching detail. During the initial crime scene sweep, a teddy bear was found on Nick's bed. Worn, faded, tucked beneath it, a note. They loved you more. But now we're even. Who was it addressed to? Billy? Romy? The past? So where does this leave us? Nick Reiner sits in a county jail, awaiting trial. His lawyers argued diminished capacity. The prosecution is pushing for life without parole. Romy has gone silent. Billy Crystal has canceled all appearances. And the world? The world is just beginning to realize that this wasn't just a murder. It was the eruption of decades of silence. Suppressed truth. Emotional confusion weaponized by instability. But the basement held one more secret. A digital file. Encrypted. Hidden in a folder labeled archive_01. And when police finally cracked it open, what they saw wasn't a journal entry. It was a video. One that, once leaked, would change everything again. Because in it, Rob Reiner speaks directly to the camera. And his first words are, "This might be my last chance to say the truth. And I owe it to Billy." What if the truth was never meant for the world? What if it was only meant for one person, and now everyone can see it? Because when that encrypted file surfaced, investigators expected evidence. Maybe a confession. Maybe a farewell message from a man who sensed danger closing in. What they did not expect was intimacy. Raw. Conflicted. Human. The video file was short. Just under 9 minutes. Grainy. Dimly lit. Rob Reiner sat alone in what appeared to be his private study. No script. No polish. No humor. Just a man unraveling. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands shaking slightly. "This isn't for the press," he said. "It's not for the kids. It's not even for Michelle." He swallowed. "It's for Billy." And with that, the case took a turn no one, absolutely no one, was ready for. Because the video didn't just hint at secrets. It confirmed that something had been buried for decades. Something powerful enough to fracture a family. Something volatile enough to ignite a mind already on the edge. And something Billy Crystal never expected to see leaked to the world. The leak didn't come from the police. It didn't come from the court. It came from a sealed source. Someone close enough to the investigation to have access, and reckless enough to believe the public deserved to know. Within hours, fragments of Rob's video transcript were circulating online. Then came the second leak. Billy Crystal's journal. Not the whole thing. Just excerpts. Enough to set the internet on fire. Enough to force Billy into silence. Enough to change how everyone viewed the murders. The first excerpt was dated March 12, 1993. It read, "I don't know when friendship becomes something heavier, or when loyalty starts to feel like love. I only know that when he looked at me tonight, I felt exposed. Not afraid. Seen. No names were written. But no one needed them." The second excerpt was worse. August 4, 2001. He said he'd never felt safe telling anyone before. Not even himself. He asked me if something can be true without being spoken out loud. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The language was careful, vague, but the emotional gravity was unmistakable. And then there was the final excerpt. The one investigators believe tied everything together. Dated just 2 weeks before the murders. He's tired of hiding. He says the lie is eating him alive. He wants to tell her, "I'm scared of what that will cost him. I'm scared of what it will cost all of us." That was it. No signatures. No follow-up. Just a silence that, in hindsight, felt deafening. Billy Crystal's legal team moved fast. They issued a statement calling the leak a gross violation of privacy and a dangerous distortion of personal reflections. Billy himself said nothing. Not a word. No denial. No clarification. Just silence. And in the court of public opinion, silence is never neutral. It becomes a confession of something. The question was, of what? Prosecutors believed the journals proved motive. Not Billy's. Nick's. They argued that Nick had either read parts of the journal or heard about its contents secondhand. That the emotional bond between his father and Billy wasn't just imagined. It was real enough to feel like betrayal. The defense pushed back hard. They argued the journals were abstract, emotional, not evidence of a physical affair, not proof of deception, just the inner thoughts of an aging man grappling with complicated feelings. But then the prosecution dropped a bomb. They claimed Nick had quoted lines from the journal during therapy sessions months before the murders. Lines that were never public. Lines only Billy, or Rob, could have shared. Which raised a terrifying question. Had Rob confided in his son? Had he tried to explain? And if so, did that explanation push Nick over the edge? Inside the journal excerpts was another unsettling pattern. Guilt. Billy didn't write like a man basking in forbidden romance. He wrote like someone burdened by responsibility, someone afraid of consequences, someone who knew silence had a price, and that price might eventually be paid by others. One entry read, "I worry that what comforts me is hurting someone else. I worry that staying quiet isn't kindness. It's cowardice. Cowardice." That word echoed through the case, through the courtroom, through every late-night panel discussion dissecting the tragedy. Was Billy a coward? Or was he a man trapped by an era that never allowed him to name what he felt? Then came the most controversial revelation. A footnote, handwritten, barely legible, but devastating. If he tells her, I lose him. If he doesn't, I lose him anyway. Investigators interpreted this as emotional dependency. The defense called it poetic exaggeration. Nick's lawyers called it the spark. Because from Nick's perspective, the equation was simple. Tell the truth, destroy the family. Hide the truth, destroy yourself. Either way, something had to burn. As the journal leaks spread, so did the backlash. Billy's past interviews were dissected frame by frame. Moments of closeness replayed. Old jokes reinterpreted. Private smiles turned into evidence. And still, Billy remained silent. Friends said he was devastated. That he felt responsible in a way he couldn't articulate. That he kept repeating one sentence to those closest to him. I never thought my feelings could hurt anyone. But they had, whether directly or indirectly. And now, as prosecutors prepared to introduce portions of the journal into evidence, a new question emerged. What else was there? Because journals don't tell the whole story. They hint. They allude. They conceal as much as they reveal. And Rob Reiner's video suggested something even deeper. Something Billy never wrote down. Something only Rob could say. Something that might explain why Nick snapped when he did. Why Michelle confronted Rob that night. Why the house turned into a crime scene. And why Romy told police to look in the basement. Because there was one line in Rob's video that never leaked. One line investigators kept sealed. A line they believed could collapse the defense or complicate the truth beyond repair. And it was spoken just seconds before the recording cut out. Rob looked directly into the camera and said, "If Nick finds out what really happened between me and Billy, he won't forgive either of us." Then the screen went black. No timestamp. No explanation. Just silence. And that silence? It was about to be broken. Because the next chapter doesn't focus on Billy. Or Rob. Or even Nick. It focuses on the one person who saw the cracks forming long before anyone else did. Romy. And what she knew. And what she tried to stop. Have you ever known something was coming, but no one would believe you? Have you ever watched a slow-motion collapse, unable to stop it, screaming silently while everyone smiled like nothing was wrong? That was Romy Reiner, the youngest of the Reiner family, the artist, the quiet one, the daughter overshadowed by her father's name, her mother's legacy, her brother's chaos. And yet, she was the only one paying attention. She didn't need journals to know the truth. She lived with it. In the awkward silences at dinner, in the looks between her parents, in the things Rob didn't say, in the way Nick watched their father like a dog waiting to be unchained. Long before blood stained the floors of the Brentwood estate, Romy had tried to sound the alarm. But like most daughters caught between titans, her warnings were dismissed. She's just sensitive. She's dramatic. She's always been too imaginative. So she stopped trying to shout and started documenting everything. Sketchbooks, audio memos, hidden voice recordings, a private blog under a pseudonym. She was keeping a record, not because she knew a crime would happen, but because she feared something would. Something irreversible. And when the murders happened, when she walked into that house and saw what her family had become, it wasn't a surprise. It was confirmation. The first thing Romy told detectives was simple. It's Nick. You have to look at Nick. But her second statement was what chilled the lead investigator. She said, this wasn't about money. It wasn't about jealousy. It was about identity, about who Dad really was, and who Nick could never be. She went on to describe a family that had been quietly crumbling behind the Reiner smile. Michelle had been growing distant for years. Rob had grown more reflective, more agitated, especially after phone calls with Billy. Nick had become obsessed with patterns. He kept saying things like, do you see it now? They're always together, even when they're not. Romy said Nick would stalk her father's calendar, find overlaps in Billy's travel schedule. Dad would say he was golfing in Santa Barbara, and Nick would find a photo of Billy at the same resort. She laughed bitterly during the interview, like anyone cared that two 70-year-old men had lunch together. But to Nick, it was betrayal. It was war. There was one moment, just 2 months before the murders, that Romy would later recount in full. She was in the kitchen, early evening. Nick walked in, silent, pale. He looked like he hadn't slept. He was holding one of Rob's old screenplays, The Story of Us. He dropped it on the counter. You know this isn't fiction, right? He said. What are you talking about? Romy replied. That scene where the guy says, I didn't cheat. I just gave her the part of me I used to give you. That's real. That's Dad. That's Billy. Then he stormed out. Romy told their mother that night. Michelle brushed it off. He's emotional. He's creative. He's always been intense. But Romy wasn't convinced. Because she'd been keeping her own secrets too. Months earlier, Romy had installed a discreet audio recording app on her phone. She started capturing snippets of conversations, moments she felt were off. One particular file was labeled 7/15 study room. It was a conversation between Rob and Michelle. Low volume, muffled in places, but clear enough to decipher the emotional tension. Michelle, are you in love with him? Rob, that's not the point. Michelle, it is exactly the point, Rob. Rob, it was never physical. It was never a betrayal like that. Michelle, but it was a betrayal. You gave him your inner life. You gave him the parts of you I never got. Silence. Then Rob says, I was just trying to protect everyone, including Nick. That recording never made it into court. But it was enough for Romy. Enough to know her family was teetering on something dangerous. And then came the week of the murder. Romy said Nick went quiet. Not brooding. Not ranting. Quiet. She described it as the scariest version of him. Calm. Focused. Smiling at odd moments. She told Michelle again. Her mother told her to stop feeding into it. So Romy made one final move. She wrote a letter. To Billy Crystal. We've never seen the letter. But we know it existed. Because Romy told investigators, she slid it into an envelope and handed it to a mutual friend, someone close to both families. She wanted to warn him, to tell him that Nick was spiraling, that the truth was bleeding into the open, and that her father was cracking under the weight of decades of denial. But the letter never made it. At least, not in time. Billy later claimed he never received it. And Romy? She blames herself. Not for the murders, but for being too quiet. Too subtle. She said, I wanted to save everyone without blowing things up. But I think sometimes you have to blow things up, or the silence does it for you. Romy's relationship with her brother was never close. But in the weeks before the murders, she said something shifted. He began leaving notes outside her door. One said, You always chose him to. Another, You're either with me or against me. The final one, found crumpled in her trash after the murders, read, When the truth comes out, don't pretend you didn't know. And she didn't. She told the police everything. About Nick's obsessions. About Rob's confession. About the way her family became a slow-motion car crash. But the world still had questions. About Nick's mental state. About Rob's emotional affair. About Billy's silence. And about the moment, just after the murders, when Romy said something that hadn't been reported until now. Standing in the living room, blood still drying on the walls, she whispered to the lead detective, "There's something in the basement. He used to say it was his workshop, but I think it's where he planned everything." That's when LAPD searched the basement for the second time. And what they found wasn't just journals. It wasn't just maps or notes or photos. It was a collection of tapes, labeled, dated, categorized, and one, in particular, caught their eye. It was labeled 411. "The night Dad told me everything." A single VHS tape, untouched, unwatched, until now, because inside that tape was a conversation, and on that tape, Nick's voice, Rob's voice, a storm of revelations, and a phrase that would flip the entire narrative. Because Rob didn't just say, "I loved Billy." He said something else. He said, "You're not the only one I've kept secrets from, Nick. There's something I've never told anyone." What if the truth wasn't hidden in a diary? What if it wasn't whispered between friends or buried in guilt? What if it was recorded and waiting? Because when investigators descended into the basement for the second time, they weren't expecting history. They were expecting chaos, evidence of planning, proof of obsession. They got all of that. And something else, something far more dangerous. The basement wasn't a room. It was a world. Soundproofing foam lined the walls. Old carpet masked footsteps. A single desk lamp cast a yellow glow over stacks of tapes, notebooks, and equipment that looked decades old and obsessively maintained. This wasn't a place Nick used occasionally. This was where he lived mentally, where he rehearsed conversations that never happened, where he edited memories until they fit his narrative, where truth and fantasy merged so seamlessly that even he couldn't tell them apart anymore. The tapes were arranged meticulously. Dates, titles, notes scribbled in black marker. Because everything about the case pointed back to one question. What did Nick know? And when did he know it? The tape began with static, then a click, then Rob Reiner's voice. Tired, older, stripped of the confidence the public knew so well. "You said you wanted honesty," Rob said. "So here it is." Nick laughed softly. "I always want honesty, Dad. That's the problem." The conversation unfolded slowly, painfully. Rob explained he'd lived much of his life in compartments. Director, husband, father, friend. And somewhere along the way, he said, "I stopped being honest with myself." Nick didn't interrupt. That alone was unsettling. Rob continued, "I had a connection with someone that went deeper than friendship. It wasn't about sex. It wasn't about romance. It was about being understood in a way I didn't think was possible." Nick asked one question. "Was it Billy?" Rob didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched. "Yes," he finally said. There it was. No ambiguity. No metaphor. Just truth. Nick inhaled sharply. "You loved him." Rob hesitated. "I still do." And that's when everything changed. Nick's voice, once calm, turned sharp. "Did Mom know?" Rob said no. "I was going to tell her." "When?" "Soon." Nick laughed again, louder this time. "You've been saying soon my entire life." Rob tried to explain. "Fear, timing, consequences." Nick cut him off. "You chose him over us." "That's not true," Rob said quickly. "I chose silence. And that was wrong." Silence. That word again. The same word Billy had written about. The same word Romy had warned about. Silence wasn't neutral in this family. It was corrosive. The tape didn't end there. Rob leaned forward, voice cracking. "There's something else," he said. "Something I've never told anyone. Not Michelle. Not Billy. Not you." Nick's breathing grew heavier. "What?" Rob paused, and then said, "I didn't just hide my feelings. I hid something I did." The detectives paused the tape. They stared at one another. This wasn't in any report. This wasn't in any leak. This was new. They rewound. Played it again. Rob repeated it. "I hid something I did." The tape resumed. Nick demanded details. Rob's voice dropped to a whisper. "I made a choice years ago. One that protected me. Protected Billy. But hurt someone else." Nick asked who. Rob didn't answer. Instead, he said, "If this ever comes out, it destroys everything." Nick's voice turned cold. "Then maybe it should." The tape cut off abruptly. No ending. No resolution. Just static. And silence. Investigators were stunned. Because now the case wasn't just about murder. It was about whatever Rob had been hiding. Something that had weighed on him long enough to finally confess it to the one person least equipped to handle it. His son, psychologists brought in to analyze the tape agreed on one thing. That confession was a trigger. Not the only one, but a major one. Nick didn't just hear about his father's emotional bond with Billy. He heard that his father had committed an act so serious he believed it could destroy lives if revealed. And in Nick's fractured mind, that meant one thing: control. If the truth came out, Nick believed the family would implode. The legacy would die. Everything he hated would become public. So he did what unstable minds often do when faced with perceived annihilation. He tried to stop time. Other tapes filled in the gaps. Video diaries recorded by Nick alone. Rants about betrayal. About erasure. About being the forgotten son. One tape showed Nick pacing, repeating a phrase over and over. "They don't see me. They never saw me." Another showed him rehearsing confrontations. Practicing lines. "If you tell her, I'll end it. If you choose him again, I'll make you choose me." At the time, investigators weren't sure what "end it" meant. Now they were. But the most disturbing tape wasn't labeled with a date. It was simply titled Plan B. It showed Nick sitting at the desk, calm, focused. He looked directly into the camera. "If you're watching this," he said, "then it's already done." He talked about inevitability, about destiny, about how some truths, once exposed, can't be put back. And then he said something that made the room go silent. "I didn't want to hurt Mom, but she was in the way. She always was." That line alone nearly guaranteed a conviction, but it also raised another question. If Nick planned everything, why did Rob seem unafraid? Why didn't Rob fight back? Why did Michelle? Forensic analysts had noted that Rob's wounds were fewer, cleaner, restoring balance, ending a story that had gone on too long. In one final tape, recorded just hours before the murders, Nick said, "People think love is harmless. But love without honesty is poison. And poison kills slowly, unless someone speeds it up." That wasn't madness. That was ideology. And ideology is far more dangerous. When prosecutors reviewed the basement tapes, they knew the trial would never be simple. This wasn't a straightforward case of rage or greed. This was a collision of secrecy, mental illness, love, guilt, and decades of unspoken truth. And the tapes implicated more than Nick. They implicated Rob's silence, Billy's absence, Michelle's growing awareness, Romy's warnings. Everyone, in their own way, had been orbiting a truth no one wanted to confront, until it exploded. But one detail still didn't add up. One gap remained. In the Plan B tape, Nick referenced someone else. He said, "I tried to warn him. He didn't listen." Warn who? Billy? Romy? Or someone else entirely? Because investigators later discovered that one tape was missing. A tape slot labeled Final Conversation, BC. BC. Initials. And that tape was never found in the basement. Which means one of two things. Either Nick destroyed it, or someone else took it. And if someone else took it, then the story wasn't over. Not even close. Because the next chapter isn't about Nick's mind. It's about Michelle Reiner. What she discovered. What she confronted. And the diary entry she wrote, what does a woman do when everything she's believed for decades begins to fracture? What does she do when the marriage she's protected, the family she's raised, and the man she stood beside reveal cracks deeper than love can seal? She writes, not to the world, not to her children, but to herself. And Michelle Reiner did just that. On the day she died, a diary entry written in black ink, crisp cursive, barely smudged, found tucked beneath a book of poetry on her nightstand. Preserved. Undisturbed. Almost as if she knew someone would come looking. Almost as if she wanted to make sure her voice wouldn't be silenced like the rest. Investigators discovered the diary during their second forensic sweep of the master bedroom. It wasn't in a drawer. It wasn't hidden. It was in plain sight. A slim black journal with a gold leaf M on the cover. Elegant, unassuming. Inside were brief, infrequent entries, memories, reflections, occasional poems. But the final pages? They were different. They were urgent, angry, sad, frighteningly lucid. And one of them, dated the morning of the murder, was marked with a star in the margin. It read, "I finally know the truth." That line alone sent chills through the task force. Because Michelle Reiner wasn't a passive wife. She was intelligent, sharp, emotionally intuitive. And the truth she discovered that day didn't just shatter her heart. It might have cost her life. The full entry was just under 2 pages long. Here's what it said, transcribed exactly line for line. I've spent years pretending, and now I have to ask myself the question I've avoided for too long. Was he ever truly mine? Or was I the placeholder for a life he never had the courage to live? Then there was a pause, 3 dots in the margin. A breath, maybe. A moment. Then she continued. Last night he confessed something. Not directly, not clearly, but enough. I asked him if he ever loved me the way he loves Billy. He said, not in the same way. That was all I needed. Those words, not in the same way, echoed throughout the courtroom during the preliminary hearings. They weren't dramatic. They weren't cruel. But they cut like a knife. Because they revealed a lifelong imbalance. A marriage built on uneven foundations. And the moment Michelle finally saw it, she stopped protecting him. In her final lines, Michelle made something heartbreakingly clear. She wasn't just grieving her marriage. She was preparing for a confrontation. She wrote, I can't unsee it now. I see it in the way he lights up when Billy calls. I see it in the photos Nick has obsessively archived. I see it in our daughter's eyes. She's known longer than I have. And I worry what this will do to Nick. He's spiraling. He told me yesterday that Dad made his choice. I asked what that meant. He said, you'll see. And I think I just did. That sentence, you'll see, was chilling in retrospect. Because just hours after Michelle wrote those words, she was dead, stabbed in the back, falling down the stairs, with blood on her hands, not metaphorically, but literally, as if she'd tried to hold the pieces of her broken family together one last time. But she couldn't. No one could. Romy later confirmed that Michelle had pulled her aside that very morning. She hugged me too long, Romy said in court. Told me she loved me more than anything. And then she whispered, be ready. Everything is about to change. That moment would haunt Romy forever. Because she never got to ask what her mother meant. And now she believes Michelle knew something would happen. Whether she feared Nick, or simply feared the fallout of truth finally breaking free, we may never know. But we do know this. Michelle was done being silent. And when someone breaks the unspoken rules of a silent household, there are consequences. In the final paragraph of her diary entry, Michelle wrote something that prosecutors called the emotional smoking gun. She said, he said he had something to tell me tonight. Something that would change everything. I think I already know what it is. I think I've known for years. But now that I'm finally ready to hear it, I'm terrified it's too late. She closed the diary with one final sentence. Alone. Isolated. Like a whisper. If I'm gone, please let them know I wasn't blind. Just in love. That single line transformed public perception of Michelle Reiner. She wasn't a victim of ignorance. She was a casualty of love, silence, and timing. And when Billy Crystal was shown the page during his deposition, he reportedly wept. Uncontrollably. Not because he felt responsible for Michelle's death, but because, in his words, I never wanted her to hurt. She was never the enemy. She was collateral. And Nick, when shown the diary, he stared at it for a long time, then reportedly muttered, so she did know. Whether that brought him peace or more rage, no one could tell. But his tone was bitter, hollow, like a man who burned the world to get answers, only to find they were already known. The diary changed the trial, changed the tone. Suddenly, this wasn't just a story about an unstable son and a closeted father. It was about a woman who stood in the middle, trying to hold the truth in one hand and her family in the other, and ultimately losing both. But as powerful as Michelle's diary was, it wasn't the final word, because Romy had one more piece of evidence. Something she'd never told police. Something she didn't even realize she still had. A voicemail, left on her phone at 2:17 a.m., roughly 30 minutes before her parents were killed. A voicemail from her mother, barely 12 seconds long. In it, Michelle says, he's downstairs. With Nick. He just said, I can't believe he said that. I'm coming upstairs now. Romy, if you. Then it cuts out. Abruptly. No goodbye. Just silence. The last word in her voice, if. And the rest? We'll never know. Unless someone else was recording that night too. Because, as it turns out, someone was. And the footage they captured would blow this case wide open again. Because the final tape didn't come from Nick. Didn't come from Rob. Didn't come from the police. It came from a neighbor's security camera, pointed right at the Reiners' living room window. And what that footage revealed was the last face Michelle ever saw. The truth doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just stands there. Quiet, still watching. And that's what made the neighbor's security footage so terrifying. It didn't show a chase. It didn't show a murder. It showed a face, looking straight into the Reiner living room window. A face that didn't belong to Rob, or Nick, or even Michelle. It belonged to someone Hollywood had known for decades. Someone always in the background of interviews. Always a +1 at award shows. A creative partner, a friend, a fixture. Someone who, until now, had never been considered a suspect, a witness, or a threat. Billy Crystal. And with that single frame, the entire narrative shifted again. Let's rewind. The footage came from a high-end motion sensor camera installed on the balcony of a neighboring property. It wasn't designed to record constantly, only when movement triggered it. At exactly 2:31 a.m., roughly 18 minutes after Michelle's final voicemail, a figure appeared in frame. Blurred. Slightly obscured by a vine-covered trellis. But clear enough. Billy Crystal, standing motionless, staring through the Reiner's living room window. Expression unreadable. Not knocking, not approaching, just watching. For how long? No one could say, but the footage ran for 84 seconds. And Billy never moved. Not once. Not even to blink. Then, without a word or gesture, he turned and walked away. Investigators were stunned. Billy had never mentioned being near the property that night. He claimed he was at home, alone. He said he hadn't seen Rob or Michelle in over a week. And yet, there he was, caught on tape, after midnight, outside their home, mere minutes before their deaths. It wasn't proof of murder, but it was something else, something harder to define. Presence, intent, and in this case, maybe complicity. When confronted with the footage, Billy reportedly went pale. He didn't deny it. He didn't argue. He just said, "I didn't go inside. I just needed to see him." The detectives asked what he meant. He replied, "We were supposed to talk. He said he had something to tell me. Something big. I was scared. I didn't know if I wanted to hear it." They asked why he didn't knock. He said, "Because I saw Michelle. And she saw me." That line sent chills through the room. Because that meant the last face Michelle Reiner ever saw was not her son's. It was Billy's. So what did Hollywood know? More than it ever admitted. The public image of Rob and Billy was one of comedic genius, of timeless chemistry, of friendship forged through decades of laughter. But behind the scenes, there were whispers. At rap parties, in green rooms, in hotel bars, people talked. They talked about the way Billy looked at Rob, the way Rob softened around Billy, the way their wives sometimes stood slightly apart at events, quiet and reserved. Tom Hanks once reportedly joked at a roast, "If Rob and Billy ever get married, I want to officiate, because God knows it's been long enough." Everyone laughed. Rob and Billy laughed too. But insiders noticed the flicker in Michelle's eyes, and the way Billy left early. Every time. One producer on When Harry Met Sally later confessed, that movie wasn't about Meg and Billy. It was about Rob and Billy. That was the real love story. Others backed it up. An assistant director recalled seeing the two men arguing during filming. Not fighting, arguing. Intensely, emotionally, then hugging, silently, for minutes. "They forgot we were there," she said. "They were somewhere else." Was it a romance? Was it unrequited? Was it a creative soulmate bond too complicated for labels? No one really knew, but everyone saw it. And no one talked about it. Because to talk about it meant unmaking something sacred. Hollywood needs its legends. And Rob and Billy were legends. To break that image would be to break something people didn't want to live without. So they stayed silent. Like everyone else in this story, Billy Crystal's inner circle has remained loyal. But cracks are forming. An anonymous former assistant claims Billy had grown increasingly erratic in the months before the murders. Isolated, sleepless, obsessed with an unfinished chapter in his life. He was seen visiting the Brentwood neighborhood multiple times late at night. No doorbells, no visits. Just circling, as if waiting for a sign, as if trying to find the courage to knock. And what about the footage? Legally, it proved only one thing. Billy Crystal lied. He wasn't home. He wasn't disconnected. He was there, on the edge of the crime scene. And if Michelle saw him, did she believe he came to intervene or to witness? Did she think he was there to finally hear the truth from Rob? Or did she, like Nick, see Billy as the cause of it all? A man who had, whether he meant to or not, pulled the family apart simply by existing. In a leaked audio clip from a LAPD debrief, one detective said, "There's a kind of ghostliness to Billy's role in all this. He's not the murderer, but he's in every room, in every motive, in every silence. And maybe that's the most haunting part, because ghosts don't commit crimes, but they linger. Hollywood is now reckoning. Old colleagues are revising their memories. Tributes once filled with laughter now seem soaked in melancholy. And every photo of Rob and Billy has been recontextualized, faces re-examined, hands scrutinized, distances between bodies measured in pixels. Was it ever just friendship? Was that the biggest lie? Billy has refused all new interviews. His only statement, "I loved him. That much is true. The rest is between us." But that's no longer true. New evidence is surfacing, and the last tape, the one labeled Final Conversation, BC, is still missing. Or maybe it was never a tape at all. Maybe it was a meeting. Maybe it was that night, at 2:30 a.m., through a window, in the dark, before everything collapsed. Maybe Billy heard what he came to hear, and left, leaving only silence in his place. But the silence won't last, because Romy is about to take the stand, and what she says next will unravel the last threads of the Reiner family legacy.